Hey everyone, welcome to CrossTalk, presented by the Society for the Neuroscience of Creativity and co-produced by Inquiring Minds. My name is Indre Viscontis. I'm the host of Inquiring Minds and the president-elect of the Society for the Neuroscience of Creativity. And I'm so excited to present this CrossTalk event with legendary chef, food scientist, all of the above, author Kenji López. Welcome.
Hi, how are you doing?
Good, good.
Although I'm technically not neither a scientist because I'm not really a scientist, and I'm not even a chef anymore because I don't have my own restaurant anymore. So
Okay,
only
well,
one of the above.
how do you label yourself? I mean,
A
author, obviously.
writer, yeah,
Writer. Okay,
food
great.
science writer,
Food
recipe
science
writer.
writer. Well, let's talk a little bit about your journey, because you started out, as far as I understand, in an architecture degree at MIT.
Yes. I ended up with an architecture degree at MIT.
Oh, okay. Okay,
I
great.
started out in the biology program, and then stopped doing that after taking organic chemistry, which I hated,
Huh. Yeah,
and
me too.
and then realizing, oh, like not everything I enjoy about it, and not everything about biology is going to be what I enjoy about biology. And it also made me realize that I actually really did not like lab work. I'd worked in labs for a couple summers, and
Okay.
like through school, and lab work I did not enjoy, and you got to do a lot of lab work when you're in biology, and so that sort of made me think I need to rethink my career choice here.
So what didn't you like about lab work?
The pace, mainly, that reading and learning biology, it's like you can read and learn very fast, but to do actual experiments takes a long time, and a lot of planning, and I don't mind doing long, I don't mind planning and doing hard work and spending a long time working on something, but it has to be something where I'm not just interested in the result, but I'm also actively enjoying the process. And unfortunately, it's like, you know pipetting and running PCR machines and stuff, just the process was not something I enjoyed. And so, though I did
It's
find, what's that?
no, sorry. It's like, how does that compare to prepping ingredients for, when you're cooking?
I mean, so prepping ingredients can also be, some people don't like that, right? It's
Mhm.
like, I went into restaurant, that summer, I started cooking because that's the summer after my sophomore year, which is when I sort of had this thought that I don't want to do biology.
Hmm.
Instead of working in a biology lab, I ended up landing a job in a kitchen just randomly. I'd never really cooked before, and
Hmm.
somebody offered me a job cooking for the summer. And so, working in a kitchen can actually, I think a lot of people would find it mind numbing as well. Some of my early restaurant jobs, it's like every single morning I would go in, and for an hour I would sit there peeling and then chopping citrus zest, right? Because we would
Mhm.
do this like powdered citrus zest over a bunch of different dishes, and so I just sit there with a knife, just chop, 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 chop for like an hour. And so that I think some people would find that mind numbing, but I actually, for some reason, like that kind of work just kind of clicks with me. And also, like, I enjoyed sort of setting up challenges for myself. It's like the first day I did it, it took me like 3 hours to do, and then
Hmm.
like a few months in, I realized, like, oh, instead of one knife, I can take a rubber band and tie the handles of three knives together and then bounce them all together, and it goes three times as fast. And then I just get more fit. My muscles get better at it also. So you can cut down like a 3 hour project into 35 minutes, and you feel like that's a valuable use of 3 months 3 months
Huh.
of work to and it's also, I think kitchens, I think, are just more, for me at least, are that, like, I could sit there and chop onions for a very long time, much longer than I can pipette, without
Really?
getting bored of it. And I don't know, it's just, I think it's just, I don't know, you tell me, it's just the way my brain is wired.
Yeah, yeah. I mean,
I don't know.
yeah. I won't presume to know anything about, your brain wiring, but I do think that there is like, I think there is a cultural side to it too, though. I think that a lot of times, the seriousness of the work that happens in science tends to make lab environments very quiet. Just like not having a lot of joy and fun. Whereas I think like
Right.
in the kitchen, maybe if like the ultimate goal is to create a great experience for the customer, maybe there's more of a push towards like having cool music in the kitchen, or
There's
you know
yeah, there's cool music sometimes, but a lot of kitchens are also very, very, there's various types of kitchens, but most
Mhm.
kitchens are pretty also very focused, because
Mhm.
you're working on really tight deadlines and there's a lot of pressure. And so most of the time, like in a kitchen, like at least any well-run kitchen, people are going to have their heads down working hard. And so there's a lot of sort of intense focus and adrenaline that goes on in the kitchen. And then of course, like, in the old days and still to some degree now, kitchens were also had this sort of like, abusiveness to them. So that wasn't fun.
Yeah, you know what?
Yeah,
There's a
being
lot of
verbally abused is not fun, and that happens a lot in kitchens.
I don't know how much
Less
verbal
these
abuse happens in labs, but there's certainly bad behavior that happens in
Oh
labs all
yeah,
the
I mean,
time.
I've heard stories of, bad behavior. I think happens anywhere where there's, power dynamics at play.
Yeah. Yeah. All right. So you did this, you spent this summer working in this restaurant,
Mhm.
and you have this chemistry background also in your family, right? I mean, there's like
My grandfather's organic chem is an organic chemist, and actually, it was like one of his colleagues taught the class that I hated. But my grandfather is an organic chemist, and my father is a biologist. So yeah, so and we lived in the same. So my grandparents lived on 9J, and we lived in 10J, the same apartment building. And so we have meals together, and so just around the dinner table, it's like whenever my grandfather and my father were in the same room, then like all conversation was just science all the time. So it was kind of just one of the languages spoken in my family growing up. So it's something that I always had an interest in beyond just school.
So then how did architecture fit in?
Architecture. So I mean, essentially after that summer, I continued to cook. I mean, I loved cooking, so I continued to cook part-time while I was in school. And then, I kind of shopped around, and I was like, maybe I'll do computer science. I did all the sort of basic courses in like computer science and mechanical engineering and physics, and architecture was one I just thought like seems like it could be fun. And it turned out it was fun. And so yeah, so I mean, I started architecture, and then yeah, and finished in architecture. Spent the rest of my time focusing. I had to like make up a bunch of credits because I started it late, and everyone in my class was like the year below me, but I finished it.
And so like
Excuse me.
was that that education in architecture, how did that influence your later career trajectory, and how did you turn
Um,
back?
well, yeah, people ask this a lot. I mean, I don't know that the specific education in architecture had a huge impact. There are definitely parallels in architecture and food, in that both of them are these things that, on one hand, are purely functional because we need to live in spaces and we need to eat food, and they're things that everybody, the things that everybody does. But on the other hand, there's this sort of artistic side to it and creative side to it, and so it's one of the few things, like even more so than say music or visual arts, where people have to live somewhere and people have to eat, right? And so in that sense, like you as an architect or a chef, you're forced not just to contend with the sort of artistic merits of something, but also the functional aspects of something. And so you have to think about both those things. And so in that sense, I think architecture and food are related because they both have this idea of functionality and form, and creativity that have to be sort of balanced out and have to work together. But I would say it was more just the sort of the general science and engineering background you get from going to a school like MIT that I think has influenced my career more, just as far as the way I think about food, and the way I try and teach people how to cook, is very, very much focused in those sort of like first elements, ideas of learning the basics and learning the science behind it and building up from there.
Yeah, so it seems, as an outsider, when I look at sort of the culture of cooking, there seems to be some dominion of celebrity chefs, or people who are in the know,
Hmm.
or like people like Julia Child, who
Hmm.
maybe aren't overtly like glamorous and famous to begin with, but they sort of have they have this authority that they've kind of like, here's a cookbook, here's a recipe, here's how to do something.
Hmm.
And I wonder if you could talk a little bit about, you know, to what extent this, kind of authoritative looking down differs or influences, like your approach of taking more of a scientific look, like, okay, what is actually the best way to make a chocolate chip cookie? Like this is an empirical question and why, as opposed to like I'm Jamie Oliver and I'm gonna bake this cookie from
right. Well, so I try not to say, so I do have recipes that have titles like the best chocolate chip cookie or whatever.
You do.
I try not to use that terminology anymore, mainly because I feel like it sort of got misinterpreted from from the way I used it. I did that. So I came from, I worked at Cooks Illustrated for a while, and they had that sort of that naming style. And then when I went to Serious Eats, I kind of did it in a sort of tongue-in-cheek way, like, whatever is, and it was partly that. It's also partly like people click on things that say best, whatever, and at that time we were run, we made our revenue on clicks, and we had payroll and all this stuff that we had to do. So we had to get people to click somehow. But the general rule we had at Serious Eats, at least, and when I'm writing like a food lab article, is that when we call something best, what we really mean is like, in this article, we're going to show you all of the different factors that go into, say, making beef stew or making a chocolate chip cookie or making fried chicken. And we're going to show you all the ways, all the different variables and all the things you can change, and how changing each one of those things is going to affect the outcome. And so while I'm going to present you with one single chocolate chip cookie recipe, that I'm going to say, this is the best chocolate chip cookie recipe. What I really mean by best is that if you read this whole article and you follow along on the testing, then you're going to be armed with the knowledge of how to make your own version of, whatever is best to you. So I'm not saying like this particular cookie is empirically the best cookie. What I'm saying is that, everybody has a particular idea of what is best. And maybe that idea of what's best changes over time. It's like, you don't have to always have the exact same chocolate chip cookie, right? It's like, what I'm in the mood for today, I might not be in the mood for tomorrow. But if I've done all this testing on chocolate chip cookies, and I know that like, using a higher ratio of brown sugar to white sugar is going to make the cookie moister, or if I melt the butter before adding it, it's going to make the cookie spread more and get like a lacier edge. Like, knowing those things is going to allow me to modify the recipe so that I can get it towards a result that I would consider best at that moment for myself. And so that's really what I mean in those articles when I say best. And that, of course, that's not how it necessarily gets interpreted, right? Some people will say, oh, he said it's best, but I don't think that's best. And it's like, that's fine. You don't have to think it's best. But it's, it's hard to express all those ideas without being able to sit there and explain to someone exactly what you meant. And people online like to be offended by things and like to express opinions. So you can't really help that.
That's absolutely true. One of the things that hearing you talk about this, it reminds me too of a lot of the struggles that people who study creativity come along with, which is the sense that, a creativity researcher believes that it is important to understand how creativity works and, what's happening in the brain when people are being creative under different conditions, and how can we enhance it. And there's a whole, slew of individuals too who think that, well, you can never really demystify creativity. You need to leave it, like, you need to leave some things unanswered. You're never going to quite get what you need. So I wondered if you ever have had this encounter where there is this push and pull between kind of understanding why you in a recipe would suggest to do this things, and either use the tools that you're using or the ingredients or in this order, and how that kind of relates to the sort of just like, should there be some mystery in cooking, right? Like that there's just some like a magician who never gives up all of their secrets. Like, is there ever that tension in
that there should be like a secret ingredient? I mean,
yeah, or like that people are like, well, Kenji's not really, it's like they might not trust what you say so much because you're showing exactly why you think each step is out of the way, as opposed to like, well, just trust me, I know.
The reason I don't say just trust me I know is because I hate when people do that to me. It's like, I'm the kind of person who wants to take apart the toaster oven and see what's going on inside it, but creativity for me, it's like, so I studied a lot of music when I was younger, right? And it's like, if you particularly composition, right? And so if you look at like old manuscripts by like Mozart versus Beethoven, right? They're both extremely creative people, but they had very different processes. Whereas like, like you look at a Mozart manuscript, and it's like this guy wrote the thing, he came up with it in his head, he wrote it once. There's no like nothing's erased, nothing's crossed out. It's just like it came from his mind, fully formed, and he put it on the paper, and there it is, right? Whereas like if you look at like a Beethoven manuscript, it's like things are scratched out until there's like holes in the paper because he goes back and forth, and really works on a single idea. And so for me, like I'm more the type that when I'm writing or when I'm coming up with a recipe, I write a ton. Like I write thousands and thousands. Like even my children's book, which ended up being, I can't remember, like a few hundred words. I wrote like tens of thousands of words for that, and then I edit and edit and edit until I get it the way I want it. And so yeah, I'm much more of this sort of tinkerer type of creative, where it's like I get as many ideas as I can out there, and then I decide for myself which ones are good and which ones are bad. And I think honestly, like having a medium like like Serious Eats, a blog, where it's like I'm writing and publishing like 5 to 6 articles a week. That's actually like a very it was a good medium for me to learn how to write in, because that's essentially where I sort of learned how to write in my voice and how to come up with ideas. It's a really good medium because it's like there's this constant fire hose of stuff coming out, that people don't always expect everything to be perfect, and the good stuff sticks and the bad stuff you can work on it, right? But it's something that forces you to write every day. And so whether it's cooking or writing or whatever, I think just doing it all the time, even if every single idea is not a good one, just by the sheer act of doing so much of it, you're bound to come up with some good ideas now and then, and those are the ones that are going to end up sort of sticking and informing your future decisions. So I'm not sure I exactly understood the setup of your question, but for me, the process of creativity is really about about doing as much as I possibly can, and then editing it, and hoping that that occasionally something, one of those 100 ideas is a good one, and not caring if the other 99 aren't.
Well, despite my ill-asked question, I feel like you actually touched on something that a lot of creativity researchers are nodding their heads and saying that's exactly right. And that is that so often we think of creativity as being one spontaneous aha moment. But when
Right.
you look at the actual process, when you interview creatives, what you hear is exactly what you're describing, which is I had 1,000 ideas before I had the one good idea.
Right.
And,
It's like, for an example I can give is in my book, I had this recipe for this potato gratin, where the idea was, instead of stacking the potatoes, layering them like layering them in like shingles, you stand them up on their edge so that they're like fanned out, right? And so when you bake this, and then you do it like a normal gratin, like cream, a little bit of cheese, garlic, thyme, salt and pepper, milk, and then you bake it. But as you bake it, like the top edges of the potatoes kind of dry out and turn crispy like potato chips. And the way I wrote it is like, and this sort of was how it happened, where it's like it was late at night, and I was like, oh, I'm working, like it's November, we need a potato recipe. Hey, wait a minute, like what if I just tilt the potatoes on their sides, and I woke up, my wife was like, I had this great idea for this potato thing. She's like, yeah, that's great, show me tomorrow. But it's not like this was just like suddenly a spontaneous, I mean, it felt like a spontaneous idea at the moment, but the only reason I had that idea is because I've made like a million potato recipes, and I kind of know how potatoes work. So there's all this stuff already swimming in my head. And then at the time, it's like Hasselback potatoes, where you take a potato and you kind of cut almost all the way through it, and then you bake it, and the edges fan out. Like that was like this like kind of meme going around the internet for a while, like this popular recipe. So it's like I obviously had this idea of like these flaky potato upright things, and then just combine that with the idea of a potato gratin, which is like a classic holiday dish. And so you can say, and then I looked it up. I was like, has nobody done this before? And I looked up, and I tried to find books, and I tried to find recipes on the internet, and it seemed like nobody had done it before. So I was like, oh, that's an original idea. People are going to like this. And now when I write it, I can exaggerate the fact that it just like, I made some Eddie Izzard joke about how he has a joke about how when Heimlich invents his maneuver, he wakes his wife up in the middle of the night and says, I've invented a maneuver. But you know, you can make it sound like it's this spontaneous thing, but even when it is a spontaneous thing, it's like the only reason that you can come up with ideas like that spontaneously is because you've like fed all this other information into this funnel in your head, and it's like something popped out the other end that happened to be good that time.
Yeah, I mean, sometimes we distinguish like what you're talking about, which sounds to me like you did a whole bunch of kind of preparation work, and then you kind of incubated it on for a while, and then you had this kind of aha moment where like something
Hmm.
kind of popped up, as opposed to a more kind of step by step approach, which actually a lot of people following your recipes are doing, where you're slowly getting closer to the solution to a problem. And I wondered if maybe like your reverse steak you know,
Hmm.
the reverse searing on the steak
Hmm.
idea, like, did that also come to you in a moment, or was it more
So,
like a
so that one was at Cooks Illustrated. That was actually my first article at Cooks Illustrated. I think I started working on that in 2000. Excuse me. I started working that in 2006, and the editorial assignment was just we haven't done a pan-seared steak recipe. Kenji, like, come up with a recipe for pan-seared steak, make some pan sauces. And so that was one of those that, when I was young and eager to prove myself. And so that was like, all right, like, I'm going to test every single thing I can about pan-searing steak, like, letting it come up to room temperature first, cooking it straight from the fridge, cooking it from frozen, cooking it in
hmm,
oil, cooking in butter, all these different things. And then, the reason that one came is because at that time, 2006, my last job before that was working at a restaurant called Clio, which doesn't exist anymore, but Chef Ken Oranger. And right around then, 2004, 2005 was when sous vide machines first started getting widely
mm,
used in restaurants. And so, like I borrowed a circulator from my dad's lab, an actual piece of
hmm,
lab equipment, and brought it into the restaurant to work because at that point there were no specifically food service sous vide machines, and people were all using this kind of recycled lab equipment. And so I borrowed one from my dad to do. And so we cooked a bunch of stuff sous vide at the restaurant then. And so we were first learning how it worked. And then so when I came, that was sort of fresh in my head when I came to Cooks Illustrated. And so the idea with the reverse sear was like, well, like sous vide was such a useful tool at the restaurant. And one of the useful aspects of it is that you can bring a piece of meat up to a certain temperature and not overshoot at all. Like you can guarantee that it's going to be medium rare or whatever,
mm,
right? And you get this kind of nice, perfectly medium rare um, color from edge to edge, which was a novel thing at the time, right? And people didn't really we're not used to seeing their meat like that. Usually, if you ordered medium rare at a restaurant, you would get this kind of bullseye pattern where the center is medium rare and it gets progressively more cooked as you get to the edge. And so it was this novel thing, and I was like, okay, like how can we adapt this idea to home cooking, which is where the idea of like starting it in a low temperature oven and then searing it. It's and of course it turns out later, several years later, in fact, almost like a decade later, I don't remember exactly when, but I found out, oh, there's actually like a couple of people who were doing this or something similar to it before we published that article. So I don't want to take credit for having invented that because there were people doing it before we published that article. But anyhow, the point was like it was like the reason I was able to come up with that idea was partly because I was very systematically, I cooked. It was like over 100 different tests I did on that
hmm,
one pan-seared steak recipe. Um, but the actual sort of inspiration for cooking it slowly first and finishing with a sear came directly from a technique from adapting a restaurant technique, sous vide,
hmm,
that I had been doing at a restaurant before that. So again, it was sort of like a combination of testing, but then also just like things that were in my head by virtue of having, some experience.
hmm,
And then putting those two things together. And maybe that's sort of where creativity lies, is like putting ideas together and seeing what happens when you
mhm.
or being able to relate to ideas and seeing what connects them, and what new things can be created out of putting those ideas together. um I certainly think that's a lot of like what good writing is about. It's like, connecting ideas
Mhm.
and being able to, especially sort of, I think, scientific writing, we're writing about science for a non-science audience. A lot of that comes down to being able to relate relatively complicated scientific principles into terms that people can understand, terms that people can relate to in their everyday life, and drawing metaphors and using language that is not usually used in science to get people to glom onto it better. And I think that, you know, that's sort of, I think, what I work the hardest at as far as my job goes.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like that's kind of the art of science communication is figuring out how to do that and how to find the right metaphors and analogies that work for people. You know, I think that a lot of creativity measurements that we have actually
Mhm.
try to capture this. Like we have this measurement called the remote associates test, which is very, very popular, which is
Okay.
this idea that like the more kind of remotely associated things are, the more creative that is. So if like you give, you know, if you ask someone to, you know, what is the what is the best chocolate chip cookie recipe? Well, most people
Mhm.
will give you, you know, well, you got to, you know, do this, that, and the other thing. You got to put in these ingredients. But remotely, someone might say, well, you know, you should put starch in there, and that might be like, you know, a remote associate would say, oh, that's more creative because it still makes
Mhm.
sense. I don't know if it makes sense. I've never put starch in cookies, but you seem to like starch, so I feel like that's potentially possible. But you know, and so that you're kind of capturing something that we do struggle with, like as creativity researchers. How do you quantify, you know, just that process of finding, you know, finding things that are associated or finding these kinds of connections amongst disparate things that other people miss.
Right. I
I don't
don't
know.
know
You
the
have any
answer.
advice for us?
um, I don't know. I would say talking to kids a lot helps.
Yes.
Because they tend to associate things that you would ever think of associating. It's always like I mean, yeah, I have a five. You have an 8-year-old and a 3-year-old. I have a
Mhm.
5-year-old. My 9-year-old is not. My 9-month-old is not doing that yet. But like my 5-year-old is like always saying like the
Yeah.
craziest things and connecting these weird things that you would never think. I remember one day she came home and uh, oh, and um, I asked her if she wanted any hummus.
Uh-huh.
And she's like, no, I don't like hummus. And she's like, wait, you mean hummus with chickpeas or hummus like the tank engine? And I was like,
Oh, that is
hummus the
so
tank.
cute.
But yeah, and so now, yeah, now we have every time we talk about hummus, we talk about hummus the tank engine. Yeah, just you know, it's like funny connections that like about like words that you never think would be associated with each other, right? Concepts that you never think would be associated with each other. Kids have a really good way of doing that. But you know, I find that at least when I'm in a sort of creative rut or when I feel like I can't write, you know, which happens a lot.
Mhm.
There's usually
Mm,
two things which help. One of them is just like forcing myself to sit down and write whatever.
hmm,
And oftentimes, like if it's a specific story, what I will do is I'll just excuse me,
mhm,
still getting over a little cold. If it's a specific story, I'll just start from the middle. You know, it's like I
mm,
know, like I'm writing this right now. I'm working on this piece for the New York Times about grilling corn. It's like I don't know how I'm going to
mm,
introduce this story because like everybody writes
mm,
about grilling corn every summer, right? So I don't know what interesting thing to say at the beginning, but I do know like what's specific about the technique I'm using. So I'm just going to start. Imagine that the first 3 paragraphs are already written and just
mm,
jump right in and start writing. And then usually what I find is that one of the paragraphs I end up writing would actually be very good as the
hmm.
first paragraph. And sometimes what I find is like if I do start at the beginning, just cutting off the very first paragraph I wrote and starting from the second paragraph is usually a more compelling story anyway. So
Huh.
you know that's part of my editing process. Just get it out there. But the other thing I find when I'm in a creative rut is that just not writing at all and just taking like a long bath and reading a lot and like
Hmm.
consuming things that other people have done. That I enjoy, whether it's like going back and reading, and especially if it's like non-food related, you know, or,
Mhm.
um, just books that I enjoy, novels or you know, things that I've enjoyed reading in the past. Rereading them will often remind me, oh, like this is what I enjoyed
Mm.
reading about this person's work, or like this is the kind of thing I find funny, and that helps you, I think, in your
Yeah,
own
that's
writing.
that's really great advice. And it reminds me of something Ernest Hemingway once said, some advice that he was giving about you know, combat writer's block, which is to always leave, um, you know, end the day knowing what's going to happen next in your novel. So like most of us kind of like write until we get everything out and then we have no more ideas. And then the
Mm,
next morning we're staring at the blank page once again. Whereas
right.
he was like, look, just leave something in the cup. like, know so that when you sit down the next morning, you know exactly what's, you're already getting
Uh-huh.
going, which I thought was really interesting. And it kind of relates to what you're doing. Like you're starting in the middle, which we know. Yeah. And then kind of so that you don't spend too much time with that awful blank page.
Right.
So one
Yeah,
of our,
I get the same way about housework. Like, so my wife and I take very different approaches to housework, especially like home improvement projects, like where I'm the kind of person where it's like, all right, here's this big long list of things that needs to be done. I'm just going to jump in and do the one seems most appealing for me to do right now. I'll get it done. Like I know I'm going to go into it with like gusto. I'll do it passionately. I'll get it done quickly and well, and then I'll think about what I'm going to do next. Whereas my wife likes to sort of, this is what we're doing day one, day two, and plan out day by day. So it's like it's very conflicting styles. And I'm not saying like one is better than the other. It's just I think you kind of have to know what gets you going and what works best for you.
So one of the questions from our audience, Alex Leviton, is saying that the food lab changed the way that their household cooks and also looks at science, which is kind of amazing and awesome.
Okay.
And they ask, how do the exactitudes of science and architecture support the inexactitudes of creative processes and your creativity?
How do the um well, so I consider both. So I'll try and answer for both, but I'll focus more on the cooking. But um, some people think that there's this sort of dichotomy between science and art, or science and
Mhm.
creativity. Um, and I don't think they're at odds at all. Like I consider science a tool. And so it's like um knowing how something works doesn't mean that it only works one way, right? And
Mm.
so it's sort of like, if you think about when a musician, right? So
Mhm.
a jazz musician who's trying to improvise, like, yeah, there's a lot of creativity in improvising, but as any good jazz musician will tell you, like, you have to practice your scales, you have to practice like your finger shapes, you have to practice your movement, you have to get the technical aspects built into you, and then only then can you use them to express your creativity. So for me, it's like with cooking, it's like the better you know technique and the more you understand how things interact with each other, those
Mhm.
those are not restrictive things, those are actually freeing things, because then it allows you, so that whatever you have in your head, it's much easier for you to get out onto the plate if you know how things are
Mm.
going to act. And so in many ways I find that understanding, and it's the same in architecture, right? It's like there is a degree of freedom to just being able to sit down at a drafting table and draw whatever you want, and come up with these wacky ideas. But then I think the real creativity comes when you try and mold those crazy ideas through a lens of understanding structures, and understanding how people move through buildings, and understanding how things support each other,
Mm.
and refining those ideas into something that works. And I think that intersection um, between the functionality and the real physical aspects of it, and like the creative ideas, is what makes like good architecture beautiful.
Mm.
And the same with food. It's like you can admire a piece of food for the creativity of the flavors that go into it, or the ideas in it, but those things are all supported by the technique that goes into it, and by and when someone's a very good craftsman, and has practiced hard at it, whether they understand like the specific science behind it or not, you can get a understanding of the functional elements of it
Mm.
by just doing it a lot, by cooking a lot, right? And so you can tell when someone is both creative and also a very good craftsman. And it's hard to tell if someone's creative if they can't express their creation, right? And in order to
Mhm.
be able to express
Yeah.
your creation, you have to have that craft behind you.
Yeah, Food Lab is a book that put you onto the stage, but it came out of also a very successful blog, as you were describing, and I think it really introduced a lot of people to this notion that you don't need to. It doesn't need to be scary to infuse science in your cooking. That's something that is accessible to everyone, which I think a lot of us scientists really are excited to see, and I think that's a huge influence that you've made, as Alex suggests, that science in general doesn't have to be inaccessible to people. And then in April 2020, I believe you started
Mhm.
Kenji's cooking show.
Right.
on YouTube. And so I want to talk a little bit about sort of what was the idea behind that. One of the things I love about Kenji's cooking show, for people who haven't seen it yet, is you basically, Kenji says hello in the beginning, and then you see what he's doing through a GoPro on his head. So I'm assuming like
Right.
you got your GoPro
I
there,
had
and so
a
it's like that's
I got one of these. I just put this on my head like that.
that's what it looks like, yeah.
Yep.
And it's like remarkably casual. Like the one that I watched most recently, as I was looking through some of the recipes in the walk, was we'll talk about it in a minute too. I wanted to watch you produce a recipe that I wouldn't traditionally think of as one that would be used in a wok. So I
Mhm.
watched where you made spaghetti with
Right.
garlic and oil, like a kind of what seemed to me a pretty traditional Italian recipe. Here you are
Right.
using like a very non-Italian instrument. And one of my favorite parts at the end was like when you give your dog a piece of banana because he can't have or she can't have any of
Garlic
the
hand.
actual. But anyway, but that's like watching you do this, and you make it seem so easy and so accessible, and yet you seem to also have a particular reason for everything that you're doing. Like, for example, how much salt to put into the water, to use a saute pan to boil the water in the pasta, as
Right.
opposed to what most of us do, which is this like
Deep pan.
massive deep pan. Yeah. So tell us a little bit about like I do want to talk about that particular, like, just that approach and how it
Sure.
relates to the walk. But just tell us a little bit about how Kenji's cooking show started, and were you surprised by its massive success?
For a long time at Serious Eats, we started doing recipes at Serious Eats in 2008 or
Mm,
2009. And at that time, video was not a big thing, right? YouTube, I think it started in like 2007, but it wasn't a big thing. But then, sometime around like 2012 or 13, we were like, video is going to be the thing. Like, blogs are
mhm.
cool right now. That's what is getting traffic, but videos are going to be the thing. I think everybody saw the wind kind of blowing that way. And so we
Mm,
started thinking about like ways we could do video. And, and I try, especially like food lab content. It's like, how does this translate to video? And in many ways, I think I was kind of restricted by the idea that it had to be this like polished, produced thing. And so, we
mhm,
tried that various ways. Like we spent $50,000 hiring a full film crew and shot like a 6-episode miniseries based on the food lab that
mm,
was scripted and had a co-host. And and then and then we shot a bunch of stuff in house that was all scripted, and then eventually when I moved to California, I started doing stuff with like multiple cameras and scripts, and then I very quickly realized, like, well, not very quickly, but over the course of a few years, I realized like I'm terrible at scripted stuff. Like, I just sound totally unnatural when I'm reading a script. So like I'm good at writing, but I'm not very good at just speaking. And so the idea behind just sticking a GoPro on my head, that actually came because uh, it was late one night and I had come home from a vacation in Mexico where I had bought a GoPro so that I could shoot snorkeling stuff.
yeah,
And the
as we all do.
GoPro
That's why I bought mine. Scuba diving.
and the GoPro was on my desk, which is in the kitchen, and I was going to make grilled cheese or something, and I was like, oh, like, what if I just stick the GoPro on my head and make the grilled cheese? That movie, I think it was called Hardcore Harry or Hardcore Henry or something like that. It was like it was a movie that looked like a video game that came out right. It was I don't know, 2015, 14 or something like that. All shot first person style, and that movie had just come out. So I was like, oh, like, people are into this first person thing. Maybe like, what if I put a camera on my head and did it? And so I did that just for fun. It was with an older GoPro, so no like image stabilization or anything. It was really
Mm,
jittery. But I put that up on YouTube, and then over the next couple of years, I just did it a couple more times just for fun, and I never really paid attention to who was watching it or what was
mm,
going on with it. And then yeah, like March of 2020, um, I was just looking at my YouTube channel. I was like, oh, this video has like 1 million views, and
hmm.
it was just me making a grilled cheese like 4 years ago or whatever it was. Um, Maybe I'll try doing some more like that. And so I got a better camera, and I stuck it on my head. And at that point, by that point, my book had come out, and I had gotten actually quite used to. Yeah, I've never been, when I was younger, at least, I'd never been very good at talking in front of crowds. Like, I get
Mm,
stage fright. I get nervous talking in front of large crowds. But it was one of these things where it's like you practice it and you get better and better at it. So my book came out, and I went on book tour, And so I got used to talking in front of crowds. I got used to like teaching demos, especially like cooking and talking while I was cooking and showing people what I was doing. And then also, when you do live demos, you're always making mistakes. And so you have to be able to talk about why this mistake happened and just roll with it. So I had this kind of like practice doing that and this kind of banter already set up. The parts that made me nervous about being on camera, which is like having a camera pointed on my face and having to talk to it from a script, by sticking the camera on my own head so that people weren't looking at me and they were focusing really on the food. I could just pretend I was showing a friend or showing an live audience and talk through what I was cooking. And that's really how I thought of it. It's just like, I'm just pretend I'm doing a live demo, which essentially is what I am doing. It's going to be casual. People understand that it's live. So it's okay to have mistakes in it. That was sort of the formula. It was sort of like the anti-cooking show thing where it's like, it's just about the food. It's not really about you don't really see me in it much. It's not scripted. I don't plan what I'm doing ahead of time. So like oftentimes you'll see like I don't have the exact right ingredients for a recipe. And I think it ends up being actually like a very good compliment for the book, because the book seems like this very precise thing. It's like you need this exact list of 40 ingredients or whatever. But what I try to show in the show is like, hey, like I'm a normal person with a normal house. There's 5 family members here. There's dogs. Like it's always a mess because I have 2 kids. And like my wife and I have different ideas of kitchen organizations, that things are all over the place. Like this is how most people live. I think showing how like understanding these principles of cooking and how they can apply to a chaotic everyday life and how they can actually help you navigate that in the kitchen, I think is what has become attractive to people.
And people don't, it's massively successful. I mean, it's like the anti-cooking show that like beat out all the cooking shows out there. And it's sort of like out Jamie Olivering Jamie Oliver.
Well, I don't know about that.
But it's like one of my favorite moments is where like you're like looking for an instrument and you like pull out a drawer and it's like the drawer is a mess and you're like, where's that? Oh, here it is. And then you pick it up. It's like, yeah, now I feel like I can pick up that cookbook, the wok, and do whatever it is in there because I watch you do this one recipe in it. And when I just see it on the page, it feels like, oh, this is going to be a lot of work and it's going to be hard. And then just watching you do it, I was like, oh, I can totally do that.
Yeah.
And so let me talk. Can I talk about like a couple of little specific things? One, it seems like you use a lot of salt, especially in that recipe.
Okay.
And I wonder if you could. I mean, and I know that this is true of chefs in general. That like but I wonder if you ever think about like, what is the science behind using a lot of salt in recipes? Why is it that it makes things more flavorful? And why is it such a like universal tool? And do we have to worry about it ultimately in terms of how it affects our health? That's a lot of questions.
I mean, the reason it makes foods taste good is because it literally like opens up neural pathways that help you taste things better, right? So it's like if you eat a tomato with no salt on it, it tastes fine, but then you put salt on it, it does, even just like a teeny pinch of salt, not enough to make it taste salty, it'll just taste more like a tomato, right? And it's just because it allows your tongue to perceive these things better. So in that sense, salt is the reason, and also the reason chefs use a lot of salt is partly because, especially like, I had a beer hall, and so it's like you use as much salt as you can without making foods taste like out of this world salty, because people order beer when they're when they're
thirsty.
Foods and salt tastes good, right? That's part of what makes restaurant food taste better than home cooked food, is because it's seasoned up to the edge of where it becomes unpalatable. And I think there probably is something to the idea that chefs like over time lose sensitivity to it. So things that seem reasonably well seasoned to a normal person might seem underseasoned to me. The health thing, I'm not a nutritionist, so I can't really answer. From what I gather, most people are fine with it's like talk to your doctor. Some people are very sensitive to salt. Some people have specific health reasons they need to limit their salt intake, but most people just pee it out. So you're probably fine unless you have high blood pressure or some other issue that you're dealing with. And for me, it's like, I feel like if you're cooking at home and you're generally cooking from scratch and and you're preparing your own foods and you're eating a wide variety of foods, like you're doing a good job of keeping it's like, really, I think people worry a little too, it's like, when you're being healthy, right? And
Right.
it's like, don't eat hamburgers every day. That's not good for you. You don't eat a pound of bacon every day. That's not good for you. Just like eat a variety of things, eat mostly vegetables, like all those things that I think people know and then try to like finagle their way around because they want to eat more of something else. And that's fine. Like sometimes I eat, but I think also people like, people ask me a lot like, oh, how are you not like 300 pounds doing what you do? And it's like, well, um, what you see all is not necessarily what I always eat, right? It's like you see, maybe I make like one video a week, and so you're seeing one meal out of the 20 something meals that I eat in each week, and that's not necessarily, I'm not going to show you like every little salad I eat. And the same, it's like on my Instagram, I go around and taste things, but it doesn't mean that like I ate. If I go and order like 4 slices of pizza because I want to try 4 different types of pizza, I didn't eat all 4 of those slices of pizza all by myself all at once, right? And so,
Right.
generally it's like, portion control, getting a good wide variety of foods. Pre-pandemic, I exercised, like I went to the gym 6 days a week, and now I don't, which is why I gained like 30 pounds through the pandemic. But in general, I think just the same advice everyone has, which is like, eat a variety of healthy foods and exercise, then you're probably fine.
Yeah.
Then at that point, like salt intake, I don't feel like is your biggest concern, really.
Yeah, you're making me feel a lot better because I once made the mistake of putting a little bit of salt on some cucumbers for my daughter, my 3-year-old, and now she like will not eat cucumbers without salt.
I won't
She'll
eat
like
cucumbers without salt.
she is like, we go anywhere and she's like, did you put salt on the cucumbers?
That's actually what, like, one of my earliest flavor memories I remember is like my grandmother sprinkling salt on cucumber slices and thinking, oh my God, like, this is so good.
All of a sudden it's delicious. Yeah. So Hannah says you obviously have a lot of experience cooking, and one of the things that she's noticed in your videos is that you feel comfortable making extreme substitutions, which we creativity researchers could argue is like highly creative. But it also seems to take a lot of like, how do you feel comfortable making these substitutions? Is it a matter of like, well, you just know that X equals Y or will have the same effect, or what?
It's a little of both. Like part of it is just experience and knowing that, like, what fish sauce adds to a dish is pretty similar to what soy sauce adds to a dish, something like that. I don't know what extreme substitutions I make, but yeah, but part of it is that, and then the other part of it is just not caring. Like, um, it's like, sometimes it's like, okay, if I want to recreate that childhood dish I had, or if I want to recreate like my favorite dish from this restaurant and do it exactly the right way, then sure, no substitutions. Like if I want to fairly test someone's recipe from a book, then sure, I'll do no substitutions. But most of the time, I don't care. It's like, I don't care if it's exactly the same as the last time I had it. I don't care if it's exactly the way my mom made it. Like, I'm going to taste it as I go. If it tastes good to me right now, then to me, that's what matters at that point, so I think there's a big difference between home cooking and like restaurant cooking. It's like at my restaurant, we have, we had recipe books with procedures, and you weigh out everything. Everything has to be exactly the same every time, because when a customer comes in, they want the potato salad to taste exactly the same. They want the potato salad they know. Right. And so in those cases, like, yeah, no substitutions. We get the same ingredients from the same suppliers. We weigh everything. We follow the exact same procedures. But home cooking, I don't think it has to be that way. It's like you're cooking for yourself and your family. So just take it easy. It's like, do whatever you want.
Yeah.
The worst case scenario, it's like, it's very rare that you're going to mess up a dish so badly that you can't eat it. And so the worst case scenario, it's like, it's going to taste a little weird, and you'll try again next time.
It reminds me of one of my favorite things that David Byrne, the musician, has written in his book How Music Works, where he laments the death of the amateur musician. And he talks about how some of the great creative leaps actually have come from amateurs because they don't care. He quotes a famous film director from Spain who basically said, "Look, all the great directors, their masterpieces are the movies they didn't care about, that just turned out to be great because they took all these risks." And I think that's really a good lesson for a lot of us to learn, because, like, especially if you're a professional creative and there's like a lot of pressure in terms of you doing your best stuff, sometimes caring too much can come in the way of creativity. Okay. So I'm pulling up this very heavy book. That's why it's not on my desk. Called The Walk: Recipes and Techniques. This is your most recent book, just came out. And I want to talk about, first of all, why it is that the wok is the tool that you reach for most often when you're cooking at home.
Well, I mean, obviously part of it has to do with the fact that like I grew up in an Asian household. My mother's Japanese, my grandparents are Japanese, and I grew up with all three of them at home. And Japanese was my first language. My mom cooked a lot in a wok. Anytime she deep fried, it was in a wok. So part of it is just something that I was used to. And my dad has always been obsessed with Chinese food, and so we spent a lot of time going around Boston and New York, Chinatown, and eating. And so so just the types of dishes that are traditionally cooked in woks are things that are particularly appealing to me. But beyond that, I just find it to be an extraordinarily versatile pan, especially for the type of cooking which I do, which is generally fast and improvisational and based on what I have. I think a wok is great for that. It's a great tool for going when you go to the farmer's market, or when you dig through your vegetable drawer and you have like a bunch of half-used vegetables, like figuring out ways to use those. I think a wok is a great tool for doing that. But yeah, it's just versatile. As people think of it as a tool just for stir frying, but it's the best pan in the kitchen that I can think of for deep frying. You can steam in it, you can braise in it, you can shallow fry in it, you can toss pasta in it really easily. It's like you're mentioning that video with the garlic spaghetti, but when you finish pasta and you're adding pasta water and you're trying to emulsify it in a pan, like a wok is like built for tossing and stirring, so it's like great for doing stuff like that as well. So I think just the size of it and the lightweightness and the versatility makes it really useful. It's hard to say because I don't specifically think to myself every day like today I'm going to choose the wok. It's like I just find myself reaching for it. It's the pan. I've had the same wok in my kitchen for over 20 years, and I use it virtually every day, at least multiple times a week. And I just find myself reaching for like more than anything else, which is something that I talked about it in my first book in the Food Lab at the beginning. How there's a whole section on pots and pans at the beginning, and I wrote this big thing about the wok and how versatile and how great it is. And then there was originally a wok chapter in that book that we edited out because the book was too long. But we never edited out that bit that says like woks are amazing. So there's this whole bit that says woks are awesome, and then like nothing else in the rest of the book. And so when I started writing the second volume of it, I started again. This was like one of those things where it's like where I have the list of house chores and I just did whatever seemed easiest to me. And so I had this list of bits that was going to go into the second volume of the Food Lab, and the wok was like the part that was like that's the one that I want to start with. And so I started writing that, like several hundred pages in, and I hadn't gotten past like the introduction and the stir fries yet. So so I told my editor, let's make this into a whole book, and she liked the idea.
I mean, it's definitely so. The wok was one of the instruments that we actually got rid of a number of years ago because we weren't using it enough, and now we're gonna have to go and buy a new one because you've convinced us that. But one of the things that I think a lot of people are thinking about now, and they're switching their gas stoves for induction cooktops because it's just more environmentally friendly, and that's the one thing that there doesn't seem to be an attachment that you could, or a wok that is usable on an induction oven.
Yeah.
Well, is there? Or there are. Okay.
Yeah. So for certain dishes, there's this flavor wok, like that smokiness, right? The breath of the wok, that is an essential part of the dish. So in particular, dishes like beef chow fun or certain types of fried rice or fried greens where you want that smoky flavor, that's really hard to get on induction or resistive coil cooktops because that relies on actual flames vaporize, igniting the atomized oil and having those sort of like carcinogenic delicious things fall back into the food that give it that smoky flavor. And so those dishes are hard to recreate without gas. That said, like 99% of the dishes you cook in a wok like don't really require that flavor and can be done on induction. So you just need a flat bottom wok to work on induction. In fact, like when I was on my book tour and doing demos, I did everything on induction.
Oh wow.
And it works fine. At home, I have a gas range at home, but I've tested every recipe in the book. I've also tested on an induction cooktop, and the only ones that don't work are those ones that require the wok flavor. So if you really want those flavors, or you really want to say cook a restaurant style dish that requires a ton of high heat and a gas flame, you can either get an outdoor burner, for 100 or $200 if you have the outdoor space. Or you can get a camp stove, like a portable, butane tank burner, which, don't use them in your home unless your home is well ventilated. But if you have like a range hood that a lot of people do, even over their induction cooktops, like you can set it right on the cooktop and use the gas flame there, and just pull it out just when you want to do those specific dishes. Or if you prefer having the gas just for the wok, pull that out just for when you're using the wok. And those actually work really well. Induction cooktop. So my gas range right now it's a relatively like high-end home range, and the biggest burner on it, I think, gets up to 18,500 BTU per hour, right? A restaurant style gas wok range will get up to around 100 to 150,000 BTU per hour, so about 10 times more, on the order of 10 times more. A induction cooktop that plugs into regular household 120 volt outlet, the maximum it can do is 1800 watts, which I think is the equivalent of about 6,000 to 6,500 or so BTU per hour. So it seems like it's a lot weaker than an 18,500 BTU stove, but what you have to remember is that induction is 100% efficient. So when you put the the only thing that's heating up when you put a ferrous pan on an induction cooktop is the metal itself. So you're losing almost virtually no heat to the outside air. Whereas with a gas range, especially one that's designed for a Western skillet, like your big burner, the big burner on a gas range has a wide spread pattern because it's designed to heat up like a big 12-inch skillet evenly. So when you put a wok on it, a lot of that heat just dissipates. It goes straight up the sides, goes out to the sides of the kitchen. It heats up your kitchen. So you're actually getting, comparable heat levels as far using a regular household current induction cooktop, like a normal induction cooktop, and a really powerful Western style gas burner. So in many ways they're comparable. And those little butane burners, the ones that are designed for camp stoves, if you get one that does around 15,000 BTU per hour, which is about the highest they get, there's a couple companies that make those. Iwatani is the one that I use. Those ones actually have flames that concentrate more, so they actually heat. My wok will work a lot better on like one of those, on that little dinky portable cooktop, than it does on like the biggest burner on my home range. So all those things, like comparing like the numbers and the BTU output on those things can be a little deceptive. And so people who think that their induction cooktop is not powerful enough, it is. You just have to learn how to properly preheat things and cook in batches, etc. All the things you would have to do with the gas range anyway.
Wow, that's really encouraging and good to know. So we're coming up to the end of our hour, and Connie Phelps has a really interesting question. They apparently conducted a molecular gastronomy Saturday enrichment camp for children.
Okay.
Which sounds like, that's totally what I would sign up my kids for if I could. And they purchased your book in preparation. I'm not sure if that's the Food Lab or the Walk or Every Night is Pizza Night, which is your children's book. I'm assuming it's the latter. But they ask, what are the top 3 things you would tell children about food science?
The top 3 things. Top 3 things to tell children about food science. I mean, I would avoid thinking of like specific food science principles and just think more about science in general, which is that, like, I think, like, so with my daughter, the way we encourage her to think about food, especially like be open to new ideas in food, is to actually do experiments. So we'll do like taste tests. So sometimes what we'll do is like we'll ask her to, like, she'll pick out 5 different spices from the spice drawer, or we'll pull out like 3 different olive oils, and we'll do taste tests, and we'll ask her to think about things critically. And so we'll taste things one at a time, ask her to use words to describe it, or we can give her like a set of like 10 words and she can pick which ones describe it. And so I think getting kids to think critically like that is just good practice in general for analytical thinking and scientific thinking. And it's really easy to apply to food because it's something you do every day. Another thing that we like to do with our daughter is when she's eating foods. Some kids like to disassemble and eat ingredients separately, which my daughter does also. Like, you give them a sandwich, she'll eat, or like you give her a
Mhm.
bagel with cream cheese and she'll lick all the cream cheese off first and then she'll eat the bagel.
Yeah.
And so what we try and encourage her to do is sometimes do the opposite, where it's like, okay, she's got like a cucumber on her plate and she's got like some yogurt on her plate. All right, like, eat some cucumber, eat some yogurt. Now eat them together and describe what's different when you eat them together versus eating them
Huh.
separately. So again, I think just encouraging the sort of creativity and analytical thinking. And then finally, I think encouraging kids to write things down and remember things,
Mm.
and to be open to new experiences. So it's like, if my daughter says, I don't like asparagus, right? Which sometimes she doesn't like asparagus. It's like, all right, you can remember you don't like it. We'll ask her each day, like, what are the things that you do like? What are the things you don't like? No, not every day, but occasionally. So she has this like list going. But what we always encourage her to do is like to remember that just because you said something today doesn't mean that it's going to apply in the future, and you can always retest it. So it's like,
Mm.
instead of saying I don't like asparagus, and I guess this is not necessarily so much of a analytical thinking or a scientific principle, but just a general good eating principle, that you can say like, I don't like asparagus, but don't say like, yuck asparagus, I don't like asparagus. But it's much better to say, I don't like asparagus today, but maybe
Hmm.
when I'm older I'll like it. Maybe tomorrow I'll like it, or maybe if I try it with a different food I'll like it. And so I think encouraging kids to have an open mind and an analytic mind, and to think about what they're doing instead of just blindly doing it, is like, those are all good things to think. Like, those are all things that you need to do in science, I feel like. And and I think people think of science as, a lot of people who haven't practiced science, like, maybe think of it as a non-creative field. But I think you have to be extremely creative to be good at science. Like, ideas don't just come from nowhere. It's not just like, science is not just blindly trying things until something works, right? It's
Hmm.
you have a set of ideas, and you have to decide which are the ones that are likely to work, and you have to take ideas from different places and stick them together to try and come up with creative solutions for things. So I think encouraging kids to be creative in that way, and think analytically and put things together is just, in general, whether food or not, and whether is just in general good training to be good at science in the future.
Yeah, we're just gonna trim that clip and put it on our homepage. Thank you so much, Kenji. So, for if people want to learn more, if you haven't read The Food Lab, it's available booksellers everywhere, along with The Walk: Recipes and Techniques, his most recent book, and his children's book, Every Night is Pizza Night. And you can watch Kenji's cooking show, which I highly recommend, on YouTube. Kenji, thank you so much for joining us for this special crosstalk at the Society for the Neuroscience of
Yeah,
Creativity and Inquiring Minds.
thanks for having me.